Welcome everyone, I'm Doris Wise Montrose. I'm president of Children of Jewish Holocaust Survivors. Let me take care of a couple of things first. First of all, I had these made at the behest of a friend in Israel who is a professor. He often speaks for us. Now, I know that conservatives don't like to put bumper stickers on, but I want you to look at it this way. You put it on, you drive to Whole Foods, your car gets keyed, you get a free paint job. And you support Israel at the same time. It's a win-win, okay? For $1. Okay. Our program tonight, The Evolution of the Israeli Right, from Jabotinsky to Begin to Netanyahu, is part of one of a limited series on the history of Israel that many people know nothing or little about. It is critical that we know the facts of our history. Vladimir Jabotinsky was a journalist, essayist, translator, author, novelist, orator, military leader, and head of the Revisionist Zionist movement, which attempted to return Zionism in the 1920s and 30s to its Herzlian roots. Menachem Begin was one of his principal followers, the head of Jabotinsky's youth movement in Poland, and later the personal secretary. The Prime Minister Netanyahu has frequently cited Jabotinsky as an influence on him in considering the current threats against Israel. Understanding the current status of the right in Israel requires an understanding of the connections and also the differences between these three historic figures. It may also provide some insights into the approach of the current Israeli government as it faces a continuing existential threat. We are privileged tonight to have three very knowledgeable speakers who will devote a short presentation to each of these figures, followed by a question and answer with the audience. The speakers are Rick Richmond, editor of Jewish Current Issues. His articles and posts have appeared in American Thinker, Commentary Magazine, Contentions, the Jewish Journal, the Jewish Press, the New York Sun, and PJ Media. He holds an A.B. cum laude from Harvard and a J.D. cum laude from New York University Law School. Stephen M. Goldberg is National Vice Chairman of the Zionist Organization of America, ZOA, and the U.S. representative of the Executive Board of World Likud, a member of the Extended Executive Board of the World Zionist Organization, and Vice President of Children of Jewish Holocaust Survivors. He is a partner in the Los Angeles law firm of Russ, August, and Cabot, and a graduate of Harvard University and New York University School of Law. Professor Louis Gordon holds a J.D. from Yeshiva University and a Ph.D. in political science from the University of Southern California. His work has appeared in The Forward, Studies in Zionism, Midstream Ha'uma, The Jerusalem Post, The Jerusalem Report, Middle East Quarterly, Tradition, and numerous other publications. We are grateful to each one of them for their participation tonight. We thank the Luxe Hotel Sunset for their continued support in providing us this venue for these important events, and to the staff for their attention to all the details that make for a smooth running event from beginning to end. At this point, we're going to start off with a 1.5-minute clip from the video Flames of Revolt, the story of the Irgun. I recommend it highly. I'd love to show it in full, but it's 100 minutes. You can buy it from Irgun Media, E-R-G-O, for $39. It was made in the 1980s. It's unbelievable. So we pulled out one little clip that will lead right into our discussion. And when it's over, then Rick will take over. Thank you. Oh, one more thing. Rick and I have a very close friend, our soulmate, Ann Lieberman, who writes for a blog called Boker Tov Boulder. I put it out there. You should visit her site. You will find her subject and her writing immensely interesting and entertaining.
Meanwhile, the Irgun finds itself in the midst of yet another confrontation, this time with the leaders of the Jewish Agency who believe that after the World War, the Jewish people in Palestine will achieve their political aspirations. These aspirations are based on vague promises given by Winston Churchill. Wait until the end of the war, and you'll have the plum in the pudding. As they made their empty promises, the British put pressure on the Zionist leaders to act against underground organizations. In April 1944, they decide to act against the Irgun and Lehi, who are charged with irresponsibility and jeopardizing democracy.
מה כאן לדמוקרטיה, ידידי? מה אפשר היה לערוך בחירות לעניין זה? אפשר היה לעשות משאל עם תחת השלטון הבריטי? הרי יש לזכור שאנחנו היינו תחת שלטון בריטניה ולא תחת שלטון שלנו. מה היה פתק בוחר פה עוזר? זו הייתה באמת הכרעה, נלחם או לא נלחם. וההנהגה הרשמית, הסוכנות וההגנה שסעה למרותה, אמרו לנו, תחכו עד סוף המלחמה. אם להיזכר מה הייתה משמעותה של העצה הזאת, יש לומר במפורש, היא פשוט הייתה נוראה. מה היה פירוש המילים תחכו עד סוף המלחמה? עוד קרוב לשנתיים לחכות עד שיושמד אחרון היהודים באירופה? רק אז אנחנו נתחיל לחשוב על מדינה יהודית.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Rick Richmond. I'm going to speak about Vladimir Jabotinsky. Vladimir Jabotinsky could have devoted his life entirely to any number of successful careers. He could have been a playwright. His plays were produced at the main opera house in Odessa while he was still in his 20s. He could have been a journalist. He was a prominent one for several Russian newspapers. He could have been a translator. His translation of Bialik's poem on the Kishinev pogrom, City of Slaughter, was more influential in his Russian translation than the original Hebrew version. He could have been a novelist. His novel on the life of Samson was made into the Hollywood movie Samson and Delilah. His wistful novel of a Jewish Odessa family has been praised as a great Russian novel. He could have been an international speechwriter. He was fluent in at least 6 languages: Russian, Yiddish, Hebrew, German, Italian, and English. He could have been a military officer. In 1917, he formed the Jewish Legion to fight under British command during World War I, the first organized Jewish fighting force in more than 1,000 years. And later he formed the Irgun, which was instrumental in the reestablishment of the modern state of Israel. And he could have been an official in the World Zionist Organization of Chaim Weizmann, or the Jewish Agency of David Ben-Gurion. But in the 1920s and 1930s, he left those organizations because of their insufficient sense of urgency about the storm gathering in Europe and their unwillingness to demand the immediate creation of a Jewish state. In 1937, Jabotinsky testified before the British Peel Commission, and he said this to the commission: I'm not going to repeat any details, but you will allow me to quote a recent reference in the New York Times describing the position of Jewry in Eastern Europe as a disaster of historic magnitude. We have got to save millions, many millions. I do not know whether it is a question of rehousing 1/3 of the Jewish race, half of the Jewish race, or a quarter of the Jewish race. I do not know, but it is a question of millions. And with 1 million more Jews in Palestine today, you could already have a Jewish majority. But there are certainly 3 million or 4 million in the East who are virtually knocking at the door, asking for admission, that is, for salvation. I have the profoundest feeling for the Arab case, insofar as that Arab case is not exaggerated. I have also shown to you already that in our submission there is no question of ousting the Arabs. On the contrary, the idea is that Palestine on both sides of the Jordan should hold the Arabs, their progeny, and many millions of Jews. It is quite understandable that the Arabs of Palestine would also prefer Palestine to be the Arab state, number 4, number 5, or number 6. That I quite understand. But when the Arab claim is confronted with our Jewish demand to be saved, it is like the claims of appetite versus the claims of starvation. In 1938, Jabotinsky addressed the largest Jewish community in all of Europe, in Warsaw, Poland. It was 1 year before it would be decimated by the Nazis. He was speaking on Tisha B'Av, and here is what he told them. For 3 years, I have been imploring you, Jews of Poland, the crown of world Jewry, appealing to you, warning you unceasingly that the catastrophe is nigh. My hair has turned white and I have grown old over these years, for my heart is bleeding that you, dear brothers and sisters, do not see the volcano which will soon begin to spew forth its fires of destruction. I see a horrible vision. Time is growing short for you to be spared. I know you cannot see it, for you are troubled and confused by everyday concerns. Listen to my words at this, the 12th hour. For God's sake, let everyone save himself, so long as there is time to do so, for time is running short. Jabotinsky had met with the rulers of Poland, Hungary, and Romania on behalf of his new Zionist organization, and had secured support in principle for his plan of mass emigration to Palestine. But mainstream Jewish leadership savaged him for what they called his evacuationism, and Chaim Weizmann opposed the plan. As of the beginning of 1940, Jabotinsky's plan had been overtaken by events. He came to the United States in March of that year to mobilize American Jews in the creation of a Jewish army to fight against Hitler. Earlier that year, he had published a book entitled The Jewish Warfront, writing that the problem of the status of the Jews in Eastern Europe was of immense importance to the world's health and peace, a problem which means literally life or death to 5 or 6 million people and affects the fate of 16 millions. And that these men and women are just as anxious to help in solving their problem as any normal nation can be. And that they possess a total sum of moral and material power that can go a long way towards that solution and ought to be given the chance to do so. Jabotinsky spoke in Manhattan a week after he arrived. More than 5,000 people showed up. But the leaders of the Zionist Organization of America were conspicuously absent. They considered Jabotinsky right-wing, whereas they were allied with Roosevelt and his party. They considered Jabotinsky a militarist, which they thought inconsistent with Jewish values. And they considered him an extremist in matters they thought required circumspection and moderation. From the perspective of history, those pejorative adjectives were ludicrously out of place. Jabotinsky's message to his fellow Jews was reject silence, stand up, reclaim pride in Jewish heritage, remember you are the sons of kings, and demand the state to which you are entitled no less than any other people, in the place where your state stood before, and where the League of Nations formally mandated its reestablishment. He knew that such a state would not come from diplomacy alone, and he advised Jews to learn to shoot. Jabotinsky scheduled another rally in Manhattan for June of 1940. It was the lowest point of World War II. The Nazis had marched into 6 European capitals in 9 months. France had just fallen. The British Expeditionary Force had been totally evacuated from Dunkirk, leaving all of its equipment behind. And England was preparing for the Battle of Britain against a German military that had vastly more military resources. Jabotinsky enlisted the support of the British ambassador for the idea of a Jewish army, and the ambassador instructed the British Consul General in New York to attend Jabotinsky's rally. 2 days before the rally, the American Zionists sent a delegation to Washington to speak to the ambassador, comprised of Stephen S. Wise, Louis Lipsky, and 2 other prominent leaders. After the meeting with the ambassador, they issued a statement stating that, quote, American Zionist organizations are not associated with Mr. V. Jabotinsky's activities in any way. And the attendance of the British Consul General at the rally was canceled. More than 4,000 people showed up at the Manhattan Center for the rally. Jabotinsky told the audience that even at such a dark moment, they should not be discouraged. What I want to convey now is not cheap optimism, said Jabotinsky, but I do insist that only people forecasting historical events on the basis of last week's headlines can think that all is lost. On the contrary, there are strong chances that the hostilities are to continue, and if so, there is still time ahead of us for changes to come in. There are still immense probabilities for quite decisive changes. One need not name them. Enough to say that God's box of tricks is by far not emptied yet. This is why my belief in the ultimate defeat of the rattlesnake is not shattered, provided we all remember the principle by which all great nations live and without which they die, the principle which is the secret of our own Jewish people's survival through all these centuries of torture: no surrender. The next day, the headline in the New York Times read, Jabotinsky asks Jews for army of 100,000, and the Times quoted this paragraph from Jabotinsky's speech. I challenge the Jews, wherever they are still free, to demand the right of fighting the giant rattlesnake, not just under British or French or Polish labels, but as a Jewish army. Some shout that we only want others to fight. Some whisper that a Jew only makes a good soldier when squeezed in between Gentile comrades. I challenge the Jewish youth to give them the lie. A few weeks later, Jabotinsky died suddenly of a heart attack. He was only 59. More than 750 invited guests attended his funeral service on 2nd Avenue, including representatives of the British and Czech governments. More than 12,000 people stood outside, and 25,000 people lined the streets of Manhattan to watch the funeral procession. In London, the Jewish Agency held a memorial service at which both Weizmann and Ben-Gurion spoke. Weizmann said Jabotinsky was burned up by a sacred fire to bring about a solution of the Jewish problem as quickly as possible. Weizmann said, in his opinion, that is to say in Jabotinsky's, we had only a limited time in which our program could be realized. This may and may not be so. Factors and events independent of the desires of the Jewish people forced us to follow a path which may be difficult and above all slow. For 4 out of the 5 Jews living in Eastern Europe at the time Weizmann spoke, a Zionism that was above all slow would come too late. Ben-Gurion asserted that the great tragedy of Jabotinsky was his failure to consider practical means. And he told the memorial service that this failure, I'm afraid, largely destroyed a great career in Zionism. But Jabotinsky had not been interested in Zionism as a career. He was desperate and determined to save millions of Jews. He had a plan to save them, and he did not respect patience as a strategy. A decade after the Holocaust, Louis Lipsky, who had gone to Washington with Stephen Wise to stop the British participation in the Jabotinsky rally, wrote the following. Jabotinsky never lived in the regular time of day. He had his own time. While we Zionists saw the clock at 6, he saw it at 12. He did not know what was meant by premature. Whatever was true was timely. He came to the United States when it was frozen in the spirit of isolation and preached to his last days for a Jewish army and Jewish flag. He was dazzled by a light. He saw his people once more like the other peoples of the earth, at home in freedom, the masters of their own land, no longer suppliants and pariahs, no longer enduring inferiority, but bravely and courageously fighting for their freedom. He was a bold, imaginative, brave man. Practically alone, he marched ahead. He was sure the army would follow him someday. But Jabotinsky was not practically alone, as the outpouring in the streets of Manhattan after his death demonstrated. He tapped into a deeply buried Jewish desire to take command of the Jewish faith, and he rejuvenated the spirit that ultimately recreated the Jewish state. He turned out to be right, not only about the need to evacuate Jews from Europe. He was right that the Jewish Agency executive would prove ineffective. He was right that contrary to Weizmann's assurances, Britain would renege on the Balfour Declaration. He was right that the Arab world would not accept a Jewish state, and that it would have to be established by a fight rather than by a declaration or a resolution. He was right that the left's view of Israel as a socialist utopia would ultimately prove unworkable. He was right that the policy of selective aliyah to establish a socialist vanguard would doom millions left behind. And he was right that mass immigration was necessary not only to save Jews, but to create the democratic state in Palestine he envisioned. In 2010, at a memorial service in New York, marking the 70th anniversary of Jabotinsky's death, Douglas Feith noted that, quote, his political influence was widespread in his day and remains potent even now. Though Ben-Gurion is admired by many Israelis, no political leaders in Israel anymore describe themselves as Ben-Gurionites. None describe themselves as Weizmannites, but many proudly think of themselves as Jabotinskyites. Many Jews in America today would consider themselves Jabotinskyites, many more, if they knew more about him. History itself vindicated Jabotinsky, but historians have yet to fully, fairly, and faithfully restore him to his rightful place as one of the giants of Jewish history, the man Menachem Begin called the father of resurrected Hebrew heroism, and one of the founding fathers of Jewish independence. You honor him by your attendance this evening, and thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Ray. Perhaps the most cataclysmic moment in Israeli political history, aside from the very creation of the state itself, occurred in a Tel Aviv hotel in the spring of 1977, when the hip, chic announcer of the results of the Israeli election opened up the secret envelope and, to his dismay, read the results of the winner. He was expecting Shimon Peres, but he got Menachem Begin. How did a man who was a perennial loser, a man who lost every election between 1949 and 1977, become the Rosh HaMemshalah, the Prime Minister of Israel. Over the next few minutes, I'm going to give an overview of Menachem Begin and explain how important a figure he is for anyone who wishes to gain a deeper understanding of Israeli politics, perhaps where Israeli politics is today. And the truth is, for if there was no Begin, there would be no Jabotinsky legacy, and maybe no Netanyahu. Rick Richmond and I have discussed an old Jabotinsky essay called If I Were Young in 1932, which Jabotinsky wrote in honor of Justice Louis Brandeis's birthday. In that essay, Jabotinsky talked about the need to make Hebrew the language of your home, to fight it out with the girl you love. And he noted that the inspiration in the Yishuv, in Tel Aviv itself, came partially from the fact that in Vilna, the Jewish youth started to speak Hebrew. Well, one of those youth who learned to speak Hebrew in the diaspora in Poland was Menachem Begin. And Begin, after a short period of time in the Hashomer Hatzair youth movement, joined Beitar, Jabotinsky's movement, in 1935. By 1937, he was the head of Beitar in Poland, largely because of his Hebrew-speaking abilities. Poland was also one of the most anti-Semitic places on earth in the mid-1930s. Jewish students at universities were forced to stand in the back of the classroom as Menachem Begin and his colleague Yitzhak Shamir did. Following the Nazi invasion of Poland, Begin fled to Vilna, which was under the control of the Soviets. There he was taken into custody by the NKVD, forerunner of the Soviet KGB, and held for a year and a half, during which he was interrogated and persecuted for his Zionist beliefs. When Begin was released based on an agreement between the Soviets and the Polish government in exile, he joined the Polish Free Army, which wound up being stationed in Palestine, where he then was given leave, and he joined his former colleagues from Beitar, who were now in the Irgun Leumi, the national military organization. Begin was unanimously chosen to be the head of the Irgun in Eretz Yisrael, in the land of Israel. The revolt that Menachem Begin undertook was not pretty. We saw a clip from him earlier. There are a number of controversial incidents, including the bombing of the King David Hotel and the hanging of 2 British sergeants in response to the British hanging Irgun members. For these actions, Begin earned the enmity of the Jewish agency leader and then Israel's first Prime Minister, David Ben-Gurion. During the Knesset sessions, Ben-Gurion would not refer to Begin by name, would simply refer to him as the man sitting next to Knesset member Bader. That's how deep the animosity was between the two. And yet, there's some interesting things we need to note about Begin. From Jabotinsky, he learned the importance of Jewish unity and the love of his fellow Jews. So that in 1948, when Begin came to the United States, there was a dinner held in his honor at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York. Begin, speaking from the dais while sitting next to Mrs. Jabotinsky, said, "I know that some people in this hall are expecting me to sharply criticize Premier David Ben-Gurion from this podium. I want them to know that in Israel, I have a lot to criticize Ben-Gurion about, but not when I'm abroad. Abroad, I'm an Israeli citizen, and the Israeli premier is my premier. From this podium, I will not utter a single word against him or his government." Those remarks earned him thundering applause from the audience and won him many friends. It was also the beginning of the long, long years of opposition in the Israeli Knesset. So, if we look at the 1951 Knesset, we can go down and you can see Cherut, that's Menachem Begin's party, with 8 seats in the Knesset. If you look at the top, Mapai, Mifleget Poalei Israel, the Workers' Party of Israel under Ben-Gurion, has 45 seats. The General Zionists, the party that modeled themselves after Herzl's teachings, had 20 seats. Mapam, another labor party to the left of Mapai, has 15 seats. And Hapoel HaMizrahi, the Religious Workers' Party, has 8. So we see the struggle Menachem Begin is faced with in his climb to power. Now, what did Cherut stand for that was different than what was going on in the rest of Israel? Well, Menachem Begin perceived Cherut as a Jewish party, as opposed to a socialist party. He also ran against the Jabotinsky's old revisionist party in the first Knesset, and they did not get enough seats to make the Knesset, and they disbanded, and Begin then became the leader of the Israeli right, the bona fide leader of the Israeli right, being a small Israeli opposition. But things would change. One of those things that brought on change were Ben-Gurion's conclusion of a reparations agreement with Konrad Adenauer, the German Prime Minister. Begin, and to people in Cherut, believed this was blood money. To take money from the German government in reparations was blood money. And Begin led a march on the Knesset, the early 1950s, which got him suspended from the Knesset for several months, but ultimately increased his representation in the Knesset. Okay, so we look at the 1955 Knesset elections, we see Cherut is doing a little bit better. It's now the second largest party in the Knesset. As scandals begin to besiege the Labor Party, Begin's popularity begins to grow. Okay, we jump 10 years, and you don't see Cherut there anymore. What you see is Gahal. That was a prior block to the Likud Party of today. In Gahal was a merger between Begin's Cherut and the General Zionists and another party. And so you see them there with 26 seats. He's beginning to creep up. We look in 1973, there's now a further merger into what becomes the Likud Party of today. We see Menachem Begin with 39 seats, but he's running against the old woman of Zionism, Golda Meir, and he's not yet there. 1977, we see Menachem Begin with 43 seats to 32 by the Ma'arach, or the Labor Party alignment. What has happened? What has happened in Israel that all of a sudden there is this victory by the man who for 29 years can't win any election, who prior to this election has said if he doesn't win, he will resign, to a man now seen in Israeli culture as old-fashioned, as unhip as anyone can be in a culture driven by modernity. Well, there's one thing that the Labour Party did not understand all those years that Menachem Begin did: the Sephardi Mizrahi vote. Menachem Begin campaigned throughout the Sephardi areas, people who in the 1950s and 1960s had been disenfranchised by the Labour Party establishment. In 1977, came out in large numbers to vote for him and to pull off one of the most stunning upsets in modern political history. There's a couple other interesting elements that we should understand. I can't go through Begin's entire political career. But Begin, probably more so than either Yitzhak Shamir or Netanyahu, would regularly quote Jabotinsky in his speeches. He would say, such as, "Is there anyone, apart from Herzl, who in our time has died and whose spirit lives on like Jabotinsky?" At the beginning of the revolt, meaning the revolt in the 1940s against the British, Begin continues, "I said to a friend that when I issued the order, it was as though I heard the voice of Jabotinsky, head of Beitar, commanding me to give it. So the teacher lives not only through his teachings, but through his disciples who implement his teachings." It's Begin who set the precedent for the need to heed Jabotinsky's advice to deal with current crisis. It's Menachem Begin who ordered the bombing of the nuclear reactor in Iraq, and that's the precedent which Prime Minister Netanyahu has to help him deal with the current crisis with Iran. If there was no Begin, many people would not know anything about Jabotinsky, and many people would not be able to use that advice. I want to conclude by reading what I think is one of the most fascinating comments on Menachem Begin that I have ever read, that appeared in a magazine called Jewish Life 30 years ago by Yosef Jacobs. It all seems clearer now. My own infatuation with Menachem Begin and the hatred he inspires among Goyim and secular Zionists and sophisticated Jews. Critics speak of life imitating art, circumstances where the musings of literary and even graphic artists suddenly appear in real life. Menachem Begin is a caricature of the despised Jew come to life and thumbing his hooked nose at his oppressors. There was a time when every anti-Semitic joke began with the words, "There was this little Jew." Diminutive in stature, bald-headed, hook-nosed, with professorial spectacles and vocabulary, he springs live from the pages of Nazi propaganda. He's grubby, audaciously annexing the Golan Heights, thus denying the poor Syrians forever of the privilege of lobbing shells down on Jews in the valley. And when he's virtually ordered to rescind the annexation, he removes his diplomatic stance and garb and instructs the American ambassador to kindly inform the Secretary of State that the Golan Heights law will remain in force. And with a look toward heaven, he adds, "There's no power on earth that will bring about its repeal." And that is why Menachem Begin engenders more wrath among the nations than, for example, an Abba Eben with his Oxford accent, or the late Moshe Dayan with his swagger and stylish eye patch. And that is why Menachem Begin, even his name is so East European, annoys the secular Zionists who still like to attend meetings of the International Socialist Party, pretending that they're are equal among equals. And that is why it is upsetting to hear a great Rosh Yeshiva, whose party has cast its lot with Menachem Begin, suddenly declare that Begin is not indeed Melech Yisrael. Menachem Begin, whatever he believes, seems not to be reminded that he is of Abraham's seed.
Where the hell is Jabotinsky now? Where's the Irgun? Israel needs them more than ever, and so does the United States. The Jabotinsky DNA was not passed down to the present generation of leaders. It's my belief that the real inheritor of revisionist Zionism was killed in a Manhattan ballroom a little more than 20 years ago, and his name was Meir Kahane. Now let's talk briefly about sort of the history of what happened to revisionist Zionism after Begin became Prime Minister. And there's no question about the heroism during the revolt, and there's no question that he did some great things as Prime Minister, including the attack on the Iraqi reactor in defiance of the United States. But his was the first failure, his was the first weakness, when he made the deal with the Camp David Accords in Egypt to give up the Sinai and destroy a Jewish community in Yamit. And we're seeing today the consequences of that, as Egypt has now been taken over by the Muslim Brotherhood. That was a mistake. There's no question about Begin's greatness, but that was the first crack. The next happened with the next revisionist Zionist, and he was probably the strongest prime minister of all, and that was Yitzhak Shamir. Shamir largely did resist all the pressures that were put on him, except for two. During Gulf War I, when George H.W. Bush pressured Israel not to respond to the Scud missiles being launched by Saddam Hussein, Shamir violated a cardinal precept of revisionist Zionism, which is that the Jews defend themselves and do not depend on anybody else to do it. He did give in to the pressure to let the United States do it, and right now, that failure of deterrence that Israel now sometimes suffers from, that started right then. He also agreed to go to Madrid under pressure, which ultimately led to the Oslo Accords, which brought that beast Arafat back into Israel and created the Palestinian Authority. Now these men were under extraordinary pressures. It's very easy to stand here in a room in a hotel in Los Angeles and complain about it, but it's a fact that there was that slippage. Now let's talk about the present Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who learned from his father, Benjamin Netanyahu, who was Jabotinsky's private secretary and close confidant, and Benjamin Netanyahu had every bit of the revisionist Zionism in his genes, but they've been diluted. Not all the way, and we're about to see what Benjamin Netanyahu is made of as he confronts Iran and ultimately the Palestinians, but there have been some troubling signs. In his first time, he continued the Oslo disaster at Wye River, when he gave up a good portion of Judea and Samaria and gave most of Hebron up to the Arabs. That was a mistake that the Israelis are suffering from today. He has agreed to the creation of a Palestinian state. That's something that would be anathema to a true revisionist Zionist. And there is another thing that Jabotinsky was very aware of, and he spoke of, which is the Arabs are not going to be bought off by economic success. They can't be bribed to be peaceful. They're not going to accept Israel because they're making money and have businesses. That's an underestimation of the Arabs. They are driven by religious fervor and their own Arab nationalism, and having an infidel Jewish state occupy land that could be the size of this room is something they're never going to swallow. Jabotinsky knew that. He even said that it's a delusion to think they can be bought off. It's infantile. The present Israeli government seems to think that if you can improve the economy by helping the Palestinian Authority businesses, that somehow they'll have an incentive to be peaceful. It's not working. Now, where may he still be strong? There have been some indications. One with Iran. We have to hope he's strong and insist that Israel defend itself and not subcontract it to the United States, particularly under this president, who can't be trusted.
That's right.
He's got to maintain that basic reason for Zionism, the reason for Israel, which is the Jews defend themselves. We're not going to count on anybody else anymore to prevent a Holocaust. And we're going to know very soon about that. The other issue is what ultimately happens with the Palestinians. And there was a hopeful sign that maybe the Jabotinsky gene has been passed down. And that was when Shimon Peres recently came out and going abroad, violating what Begin did, going announcing to the world that he doesn't trust the Netanyahu government, he trusts Obama more, and it would be a mistake for Israel to launch action. Shimon Peres, 89 years old, who's a president who's supposed to be going to funerals around the world, he's pronouncing policy. And from the Prime Minister's office, they said, this is the man who made 3 terrible mistakes. One, he supported Oslo, was one of his mistakes. 2, he supported the removal of the Jews from Gush Katif. And 3rd, he opposed the bombing of the Osiris reactor. Now, if those are really the beliefs of this government, we have reason to be optimistic. Because then it's recognizing that Oslo was a mistake, and that kicking the Jews out of the home in Gaza was a mistake, and that not taking action against the nuclear capability of an enemy would also be a mistake. So we have to hope that's still in him, and we're going to know that very, very soon. The Likud party, which is the party that under which Begin was ultimately elected, is still there. It's now the dominant party, but again, it too has been diluted. There are some old-line revisionists and strong ones. Danny Danon, Tzipi Hotovely, Yair Levine. There are young Likudniks who are as strong revisionist Zionists and disciples of Jabotinsky as anyone, but they're in the minority. Right now in Israel, the political party that probably most reflects the strong revisionist Zionism of Jabotinsky is the National Union Party, which has Dr. Aryeh Eldad, whose father was Israel Eldad, who was part of Lehi. He reflects those values, but it's a small minority party. Michal Ben-Ari is also in that party, was in fact a disciple of Kahane. Incidentally, this is a member of the Knesset who's been denied a visa to enter the United States. We let Ahmadinejad, we let Abbas, we let all kinds of terrorists, but because Ben-Ari, who's a member of the Knesset, 20-something years ago was affiliated with the Kach party, which is kind of he's barred from the United States. It's an outrage. But that's probably where the disciples of Jabotinsky are to be found now. As for Kahane, he did recognize the Arab threat. He knew that they will not accept, only a very strong Jewish state that was unrelenting and was going to do what was necessary to defend its people was going to be the one who was going to be the way to save Israel. If you go on YouTube and look at Kahane's speeches, you'll see everything he predicted came true. Yet he was shunned, and his name is still considered to be a black mark, like Jabotinsky's was until very, very recently. You know, right now in Israel, there can be Jews, you go to the Mount of Olives, which was the ancient Jewish cemetery, where people have been buried for 3,000 years. Jews go there now, and they're bombarded with rocks by the Arabs. And the Israeli police look on and do nothing. That's why they need a new Irgun in Israel. Okay, that's because right now the police are so afraid of Arab riots, they do nothing and they allow that. And Jews are attacked on the roads in Judea and Samaria, and they've backed off. It's too politically correct. Where is the new Jabotinsky? We don't know. We have to hope he's going to come out. And again, I'm hopeful that maybe when it's coming down to it, that Netanyahu maybe does know what his obligation to the Jewish people is, and that he carries it out. Time will tell. Thank you.
Yes, I have a question, perhaps all three of you. As far as I can tell, the Israeli right is defined only by being not socialist and being militant. Is there any other definition, like in their domestic policies or anything like that?
Look, Israel's divided every which way. There's religious versus secular, which has become very important. There are the sort of socialist versus the more free market type. And of course, there's the issue of national security, dealing with the Palestinians. That's still the primary issue. While in the United States, it's the economy is the most important, in Israel, it's still the national defense. Now, people do tend to lump together. It is usually the people who are more free market are also more hawkish. But that's not necessarily the case. An example is a guy named Moshe Boogie Yalon, who's in the Likud, who's very, very hardline on defense, but he's completely secular. He's from a kibbutz, and on probably domestic American politics, he would, for those issues, he'd probably be considered liberal. But on security, he'd be hardline. So there are different issues, and there is some crossing between the two. But it's generally right-left is how hard are you on the Palestinians? That's the most important measure.
Jabotinsky, as far as I know, was secular, very secular, and very much attacked and despised by the ultra-Orthodox. How would he react today, had he been alive, to Netanyahu sell out to the ultra-Orthodox in the matter of drafting to the military?
It's actually, to me, quite interesting issue about what Jabotinsky's views on religion were. He was raised in a religious but assimilated family in Odessa. And a lot of people point to his last will, in which he's asked to be buried whichever country he was in, and either buried or cremated. Parentheses, both are the same to me, as reflecting a non-religious belief. So there is that view that he was not himself religious, but there are lots of other indications in some of the things that he wrote and said that if he was not actually religious, which he may have privately been, he had a respect for religion. And certainly his view was that Jewish unity, as Lou mentioned, was passed on to Menachem Begin as the principal value in Zionism. It was one of his main critiques of labor Zionism, that labor Zionism thought worker-employer relations, and socialism was more important than Zionism itself, and Zionism was a means to an end, the end being a socialist society. So I don't know what Jabotinsky would think about that, except about Netanyahu today and the issue with the freedom and military service or public service in lieu of military. But I believe he would endorse the sorts of efforts that Steve has criticized, but that I suspect Jabotinsky might have understood, to produce a unity among the Jewish people, which requires balancing all kinds of different interests from left to right, religious to secular, to hawk to dove, and that the main thing was to produce or preserve a kind of Jewish unity.
Let me comment on that as well. One interesting indicator you can find from back in 1928, when he was the editor of Doar Hayom, Daily Post, in Jerusalem. Now, a young journalist by the name of Arthur Kessler at the time came up with the idea of making a Hebrew crossword puzzle. And the forerunners of today's Haredim opposed the use of the term crossword for obvious reasons. And Jabotinsky did not make a fuss about it. He agreed to change it. It came out brain twisters. So I suspect he would be very similar to Netanyahu in his approach to these issues.
Have any of you written a biography of Jabotinsky? And if not, is there a biography you'd recommend?
The question is, have any of us written one?
Yes.
Well, I think both Rick and I are working on works about him. I would recommend, have you read Shmuel Katz's Lone Wolf, which is a 2-volume work, and there is also the classic Joseph Schechtman biography, and there's a number of smaller, shorter-length biographies.
And both the Schechtman 2-volume biography and the Katz 2-volume biography are 2,000 pages each, which may have been more than you were asking. But they're both great. They're different, and they're both great. And both Katz and Schechtman knew Jabotinsky, worked with him intimately, so they're both qualified to write it. I think both Lou and I believe there is a need for a shorter work. But I would recommend to you the book that just got published in English by Benjamin Netanyahu, published in English posthumously. The book that he wrote in 2003 in Hebrew, it's just been published now, called The Founding, in English now, called The Founding Fathers of Zionism. And in that book, it's a bunch of essays that Benjamin wrote, mostly in 1937 to the early 1940s, but he also wrote about a 30-page essay on Jabotinsky in 1981. And it's a brilliant, brilliant intellectual biography, not a standard biography, but an intellectual biography of Jabotinsky's thought, and it's extraordinarily brilliant in my view. And that book you can get on Amazon.
Thank you. My question's first for Mr. Goldman, and the others, if they want to chime in, feel free. I'm sorry I'm so hoarse. If Prime Minister Netanyahu is to militarily confront Iran, would it not make sense for him to avoid an extra internal crisis with the native Arab population and to resolve, hopefully, the immediate greater threat of Iran, and then dogpile on Netanyahu if the Iran nuclear threat is resolved, and then dogpile on about better policing the Israeli Arabs before it turns into Paris-style bad news. Again, sorry I'm so hoarse.
I don't know why we can't defend Jews in Israel at the same time they deal with Iran. It seems to me they should be able to do both. That certainly while they're getting prepared for Iran, nothing's happened yet. In the meantime, there's still too much permissiveness when the Arabs are attacking the Jews. When there's now an occasional attack on an Arab, we've seen one or two, where there's some kind of defacing of a mosque, they go crazy and they insist they're going to wind up arresting the Jews who are responsible for it. They should do the same to protecting the Jews, and one's a police function, and dealing with Iran is a military function. Now, I do believe if there is a war, you're going to see the Arab population act up. I don't think they're going to sit passively and not react in the midst of a war. And I hope that the government takes advantage of that and finally gets as tough as they're supposed to be and deals with both the Arabs in Judea and Samaria and inside the Green Line the way they're supposed to if there's any rioting or violence.
In 2000, just as a lot of us were leaving liberalism and coming to a realization that Mr. Arafat had no intention of ever having a peace, and the intifada too was starting up. I was at a meeting in a synagogue of moderate Jews, and one after another person got up and started to talk. We've got to hang tough. We can't let these few people stop us from having a great peace. And Mr. Rubin of memory all of a sudden shouted out, "Arabs out of Israel." And the room just got so tense, and all of the people turned around and glared at him. A month ago, the same group had the pleasure of Ms. Glick suggesting that we should just annex all of Judea and Samaria and just have a democracy and absorb the Arabs. So my question is, what would the spirit of Mr. Jabotinsky say about this, with two different points of view? Thank you for hearing a long question.
Jabotinsky wrote a book in 1940, just before he died. He was revising it when he died. The day before he died, he signed a contract to revise it and publish it. And in that book, what he envisioned, he still envisioned a Jewish state on both sides of the Jordan. But whatever the Jewish state was, he envisioned it having the Arabs and having the Arabs have a vote, and even ensuring constitutionally that for every officer, Jewish official in the state, there would be an Arab one as well. That was the sort of state that he envisioned, at the time. I mean, he's known mostly for the Iron Wall essay that he wrote back in 1923, which wasn't a physical iron wall or even necessarily a division. It was a metaphorical iron wall that we needed to convince the Arabs that they could not destroy the Jews before you could ever have peace. But the peace he envisioned at the time was one of Arab participation in a single state.
First, it was my privilege to be both a lawyer and friend of Irv Rubin, of blessed memory. With regard to what Jabotinsky believed, yes, Rick has exactly right. I think in reality, for all Jabotinsky's prescience and brilliance, if Israel were to annex Judea and Samaria, and I'm in favor of it, having 1/3 of the population be Arab is a recipe, voting population be Arab is a recipe for disaster. And the Balfour Declaration really didn't require political participation by the Arabs. What it did is that this was going to be the Jewish homeland, and the civil and religious rights of the Arabs were to be protected as distinct from political rights. I believe that they do not have to give the Arabs who live in Judea and Samaria the right to vote. They'll have more civil and religious rights in Judea and Samaria than in any Arab country. If they get the franchise, it could be in Jordan, which is the true Palestinian state. I mean, in this country, we have millions of people who live here as aliens with civil and religious rights, and they don't vote. That's in every country in the world. Why can't that be in Israel as well? They'll still be the envy of the Arab world. So I do think there can't be a perfect democracy. It's a part of the world that doesn't allow it. If it does, Israel will be destroyed. So my answer is compromise a little. It's still a better democracy than anything else there, and the match of the United States, again, and other countries that have people living there who are protected, who don't have a vote.
So as I see it, with the exception of Yehuda and Shomron, life in Israel is completely transparent. We can see, we hear, media shows us what goes on. So it's like living in a fishbowl. We're on the outside, we're here, and they're over there. How do we reignite Zionism, the way Zionism was born here in America?
That's a wonderful question. In working on what I've been working on, I have tried to go back and try to understand how Jabotinsky, who could have had all these incredible careers and was really poised to become part of the elite in Russian society, quite unusual for a Jew, gave it up and devoted his life to Zionism. And part of it was the charismatic nature of Theodor Herzl and the Zionist Congress. But you really need to go back, in my view, and read some of the early Zionist writings, mostly by Max Nordau, who was Herzl's principal associate. And Nordau wrote a pamphlet about Zionism, published, I think, in 1904. You can download it if you've got a Kindle for free from Amazon. And if you read that pamphlet by Nordau, you will get the same sense of excitement about Zionism that obviously influenced an entire generation, because the arguments are new and they're fresh and they're compelling and they're beautifully expressed. And now, we're 100 years later and there is a Jewish state and they've got the problems of reality as opposed to an ideal situation. So it's difficult to recapture what it was like when you were completely pure and virgin. But you need to recapture, I think, by rereading what created Zionism as perhaps the most successful ism of the 20th century. And so if you go back and you read Pinsker, who preceded Herzl, and you read Israel Zangwill, you read some of the people or the writings that are in Benjamin Netanyahu's book that I mentioned, you do get a sense of what the intellectual and moral excitement of Zionism was. And we have lost that, as you suggest, first by focusing on whether it's the 1967 lines or what percentage of the West Bank, and whether it's Judea and Samaria, and whether you should have 2 states or one. We're mired in details. You need to recover what it was that made Zionism such a compelling ism.
If you look back into the 19th century, when the Zionism was first getting underway, you will see numerous writings by Jewish opponents of the very idea of returning to the Jewish homeland. Not just for ideological reasons. It's impossible to do. The Jews would need a bigger miracle to bring them back than the one that took them out. All kinds of negative ideas. At that point in time, there were just thousands of Jews in Israel. There were no large numbers. Yet, it seems that, as Herzl said, if you will it, it can happen. So I think really, I agree with Rick, we do need to get back and look at what the original Zionists were saying and probably update that theory based on contemporary realities. And there's very little work being done on actual Zionist theory. There's so much historiography and commentaries upon commentaries upon commentaries, and very few people sit down and look at the state of the Jewish people today and try to apply it to Zionism.
First, we're not going to get there by apologizing and appeasing. We have to be proud of who we are. And be as aggressive as possible. Second, the big picture is great and is very optimistic for anybody, a Jew who wants to be a Zionist. If you went back 70 years ago today, August 23, 1942, and you talked to a Jew in Bergen-Belsen or Treblinka and any other camp, and you said, let me tell you what's going to happen in 70 years. There's going to be an independent Jewish state back in the cradle of our civilization, and it'll have one of the most powerful militaries in the world, it'll have a thriving economy, it'll be a leader in technological and medical and scientific advancements, it will be culturally something to be proud of, but there'll be some wars, there'll be some terrorism, there'll be people who don't like us, they'll say bad things, and there'll be a lot of pressure. They would say, that's an impossible miracle, it could never happen. So it has happened. So for all the problems we have now, this is something that we really need to be grateful for, and just think about where the Jewish people in Israel can be in another 70 years. So I think we have to accentuate the positive, the advances, and really the miracle that's occurred, and not worry so much about the short term.
I just want to recommend one other book along this lines, which is written by Menachem Begin. I mean, everybody in America sort of first learned of him in 1977, and everybody was surprised by his victory that they so skillfully explained. But Menachem Begin, as he said, was 25 years old when Jabotinsky died. He was the leader of Jabotinsky's movement in Warsaw and was arrested by the Soviets and interrogated about his ties with Jabotinsky. That was what had upset the Soviets, because Jewish nationalism was inconsistent with communism. And he was, if not physically tortured, psychologically tortured. And the name of his book is White Nights. The reason it's called White Nights is they did not let him sleep. They kept the light on all night. And one time they put him facing the corner of a room on a chair with white nights and no rest for day after day after day. He could not move. He sat in that chair. And he writes beautifully about what got him through that. And what got him through that was he just thought what Jabotinsky went through. And if Jabotinsky could have gotten through what Jabotinsky went through, then he could get through what he was going through then. And it's another one of these books about who Menachem Begin was that we really today don't know about. And then he wrote The Revolt, which is the story of the revolt against the British. But White Nights is a book that we all should be familiar with.
Okay, let me try to ask a question. And first, your belt. I think sometimes I'm reluctant to ask this question or talk like I'm going to talk. But I'm forced to talk about something that bothers me a lot. And I want to ask you, I'm an Israeli American. I was born in Israel. And I left it when I was 26 years old. I participated in the Sinai War, so I was in a war. Once you're in a war, you understand war. If you weren't in a war, you don't understand. It doesn't matter how much essays you read or how many movies you'll see. Now, the way I see the threat to Israel, it is horrendous. And you know, I saw the movie about Herzl, I hear now about Jabotinsky. They both died from heart attack young because they saw the threat and they worried so much, they tried so hard, and they couldn't move anything. Now I see Israel now is the same threat. I think it was mentioned, if you look around Israel, this is when I was in Israel, looking around, so many millions of Arabs with one purpose, to finish with you. And I feel that Israel now it's a huge risk and special opportunity. Israel has never been so strong, ever. We've never had a Jewish power as of today. And the only way for them to survive is to really knock the Arab world so badly that the Arabs will beg for peace, like the same way the Japanese signed to the American after having 2 atomic bombs on their land. They signed a peace agreement. with unconditional surrender. Israel has to do whatever is necessary to have the Arab world.
Please ask your question.
And the question is, do you think it's a valid solution to the Israeli threat of survival?
I think the real question is, or the real answer to your quest, is what happens when this attack on Iran takes place. If Israel is in that situation where it's in the middle of a nuclear war, there's going to be no alternative. Will that attack take place? I think that it's probably likely. And many other Arab countries in the region actually want it to happen. About a year and a half ago, I was having coffee with the father of a student of mine, who was a member of the Saudi Shura Council, and silent in the room, and then he said to me, "Do you think they're going to do it?" And I said, "Who's going to do what?" And he said, "Are the Israelis going to bomb Iran?" And I said, "I don't know. They don't call me from Tel Aviv to let me know what they're doing." I have heard from American military sources, or of American military sources, that Israel doesn't really have the capability now to cover all the sites in Iran. That they may miss certain areas that are there in northern Iran or in other places. That it can only be done in a joint U.S.-Israeli strike. So I think we'll see, I do believe that it's likely to happen, but we will see.
We lived one World War II without dual raid and without dropping atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and without the Blitz of Berlin and Dresden. We did what it took to win a war. These were bloody wars. They had to do it. Israel's got to do the same thing. They have to have the will to do that, despite all the international condemnation. So what do I think? I think what happens, they should do it, and all eat latkes afterwards and celebrate.
Well, I have a slightly different view. I'm not going to, I certainly wouldn't, if I were qualified to answer, feel comfortable answering sitting, as Steve mentioned, 10,000 miles away in a comfortable chair in a hotel in Los Angeles. I don't have the information necessary about what Israel can do or cannot do, whether we're really at the moment of last resort or not, what things have been said in private. I don't know all those things. Even if I did, I still wouldn't feel I was competent to answer the question. So I don't know the answer to your question.
Okay, my question was a little bit different. I'll speak like Israel has to nuke the Arab world. They have the bomb, and they have to bring it to the point when they'll say, "Stop, give me the paper, we'll sign unconditional surrender." Otherwise, Israel will be finished. If you look at the data, it's either or. I'm suggesting to nuke the Arab world, not just Iran.
I'm not so much disagreeing with you as saying I personally don't know whether that's a good thing or a wise thing or a practical thing to do. And how many of you were here when Carolyn Glick spoke last month? Doris has put up on the Children of Jewish Holocaust Survivors website the colloquy between Steve and Carolyn in the Q&A session, where Steve asked Carolyn, are the Israeli people ready for the pain of a war? And I expected her to answer with a sort of rhetorical, of course, we're ready for anything. And she gave a very, to me, powerful answer, because it wasn't that rhetorical and merely rhetorical answer. Her answer to Steve was, who's ready for pain? Who's ever ready for pain? But we're the same, we've gone through a lot in the past, and we're the same people. And I think she said she prays all the time for Benjamin Netanyahu, because he's the one who has to make the decision, and I don't think even she felt comfortable in saying what the decision ought to be. I myself, and again I'll disagree with Steve, actually believe that Netanyahu is Jabotinsky's grandson. I think of Begin as his son, and Bibi Netanyahu as his grandson. Because it's easy, it's actually not easy, but at least it's an abstract question to say, what would Jabotinsky do under completely different circumstances? There was no state, there was no IDF. What would he do? I don't know. But I do believe that Netanyahu is the one Israeli leader who has internalized, who's been brought up and internalized more and understands more than any other person what Jabotinsky believed, and is therefore the best person qualified to do what he thinks he would do or not do, or fit that in with the circumstances that Jabotinsky obviously was not aware of. So I'm glad it's Bibi who is in that position, and not simply someone who's ideologically pure.
Can you identify political trends among young Israeli voters? Are there?
Yeah, they're leaning more to the right. They're much more nationalistic. They're much more suspicious of the Arabs, and they, unlike the United States, where they seem to be more to the left, in Israel right now, they tend to be more for Lieberman's party at this point, for example. And again, negative, and of course there are people who decry it and say it's so terrible. Israeli youth are racist against the Arabs, but I think they've seen too much, they've learned it, and they are nationalistic, and they tend to actually be pushing the country more to the right.
Excuse me. Several years ago, Alan Dershowitz was in Los Angeles at one of the Reform synagogues on the west side, Temple Isaiah to be specific, and it was a very interesting evening. During that evening, he made a comment that he felt that it was possible to perhaps buy off the Palestinians, to pay them off, say $100,000 or whatever the amount would be, and give them a stipend to move out of Israel. I thought that was a very novel idea. What is your opinion of Mr. Dershowitz's suggestion?
It was probably more successful among the Christian population. I simply don't believe, as Jabotinsky would have said, I don't believe that they're going to just so simply give up for money. In fact, if you want to read a book and really understand where a lot of Arab nationalism is coming from, you should look at George Antonius's book, The Arab Awakening from 1938. And it will be a real shocker when he says in 1938 that the Arabs in Palestine will not leave on their own accord. They won't give up their homes and their graveyards and their religious sites just like that. So I don't believe, Alan Dershowitz is a very creative thinker, but a lot of his ideas are off the cuff. They're kind of the type of, we're all lawyers up here, and they're kind of the type of arguments that you make, when you're on the spot in the courtroom, and they're not necessarily deeply thought out.
There are people who say, let's bribe the Jews to leave Judea and Samaria. And then if they won't go, if we can't offer economic incentives to move across the Green Line, ultimately they'll be forced. If you use that same language with the Arabs who live there, of course, that's considered horribly racist and you're talking about transfer. So it's one thing, it's okay to force Jews out of their home or encourage them, but not Arabs. It seems to me to be hypocritical. I do think they're not going to go, I think people are naturally cautious and afraid anyway, and it would take a lot of money for someone to leave their house and where they lived forever and where they know to go to some strange country. So it's an interesting idea. There are others who want to combine it with making it more difficult to stay. There are polls that show a lot of the Arabs living in both Gaza and Judea and Samaria would leave, want to, or would be looking for an opportunity. I don't know whether that's believable or not. I think we have to assume they're as attached to their home as the Jews are, and again, not subject to bribery.
Mr. Richmond said in your presentation that Jabotinsky in 1936, in his address at Tisha B'Av in Warsaw, 38, okay, he said that the Jewish people were at 12th hour. Indeed, he was prescient. They were, we were. What hour are we at vis-a-vis Iran? Because the rhetoric, what we read almost on a daily basis, is what we all know it to be. And I think it's dismissed to a certain extent as the ravings of lunatics. It's not familiar with that. So I'm wondering, that was the 12th hour, what hour are we at now?
Pretty close, in my view. Pretty close to 12. And the reason is, well, we don't need to spend a lot of time on this, but Iran does not need to actually use a bomb in order to cause a series of events that would end the state of Israel. So simply having it would conceivably do it, and simply having the ability to do it whenever they want to do it may do it, which means that Israel may be very close to a position where it has to act, if it's ever going to act, or rely on a U.S. president, which no Israeli Prime Minister is ever going to do. When Netanyahu came to the United States this past March to meet with Obama just before the AIPAC conference, one of Obama's top advisors on this issue told him that no Israeli, it was not in the DNA of any Israeli prime minister, much less this one, to let the moment go by when Israel would no longer have a military option. And therefore, whenever that moment is, and that's the question which I say I personally don't know, but suspect we're close, that moment is not going to go by. I don't think. It is not simply a bluff. It is a reflection of the DNA of any Israeli prime minister. And therefore, whatever, can't quite tell exactly where we are on the clock, but that's how this minute and second hand works.
I want one more minute from you. We have, in 2009, I took my entire board to see The Accomplices at the Odyssey Theater. And we have with us tonight Stephen Shub, who played Hillel Cook Peter Bergson, and he's going to speak to us for 1 minute or two. Okay. He also, by the way, played in the series 24. He played an Islamic terrorist.
my little Jewish mother in Jerusalem was
very,
very proud of it.
Get a microphone.
Hey, thank you guys. That was very interesting. I just want to thank you for allowing me to speak for a second. Right after The Accomplices closed, I was approached by an independent producer, Eric Goldbrenner, who had optioned the life story rights and the movie rights to Menachem Begin's autobiography, his memoir, The Revolt. And he approached me, as well as being an actor, I'm a screenwriter, and he approached me about taking on the job of adapting it into a screenplay. So I took on the job, and over the last 2 years, I've sort of been bouncing back and forth from Israel, interviewing Benny Begin, Dan Meridor, Yechiel Kadashai, Begin's personal secretary, every living member of the Irgun that I could meet with face to face, and wrote draft after draft of the screenplay. And I finally, we feel like we have the screenplay ready, and over the next 12 months, we hope to raise the funds to be shooting by this time next year in Israel a movie adaptation of Menachem Begin's The Revolt, which sort of, it tells the story of Begin and 40 teenagers taking on the British Empire in a war of liberation and winning. And so in the off chance that anyone here, we're looking for potential investors, co-producers, that kind of a thing. And I know it's a long shot, but you never know who knows someone who might know someone. And so I'm happy to put you in touch with our producer, and he could get you the screenplay, the synopsis, the business plan, that kind of a thing. Steve has read the screenplay. Doris has it now, and I think we have something that could do for young Jews what Exodus did in a much more historically accurate way for the next generation, cinematically speaking. So thank you. And that's
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Rick. Thank you, Lou. Thank you, Steve.